Ja, lepo pozdravljeni. Pozdravljam vas na vsakoletni prevajalski razpravi, ki je del festivala Pranger, se pravi pesniško-kritiško prevajalskega dogodka. Letos pač nekako ni uspelo, da bi bila ta razprava prav v kontekstu preostalega Prangerja, tako da je nekoliko pozneje, ampak vsekakor to je še del tega Prangerja 2021. Zdaj, kot ste lahko videli, tokrat je tema Pranger Lyrikbook, slovenska poezija v nemškem prostoru. In sicer to je seveda v sklopu teh priprav na Frankfurt 2023. Zdaj, jaz bi mogoče kar takoj predstavila svoja sogovornika. Na skrajni desni je Urška P Černe, ki jo verjetno pač ni treba posebej predstavljati, ker je vodja, res dolgoletna vodja festivala Pranger, ampak vseeno pa lahko samo na kratko omenim, da je juristka, univerzitetna diplomirana nemcistka in komparativistka. Je že od leta 2003 torej samozaposlena v kulturi in od 2007 na Filozofski fakulteti Maribor izvaja predmeta prevajanje literarnih besedil in prevajanje humanističnih besedil. Torej ima veliko prevajalsko kilometrino, prejela je tudi Savretovo nagrado, seveda pa tudi organizira razna znanstvena in strokovna srečanja, na njih sodeluje in kot rečeno, zdaj je tukaj predvsem v svoji funkciji voditeljice festivala Pranger, ki se zaradi tega tudi pač precej spozna na organizacije teh festivalov, na recimo neko pesniško sceno, na sceno prevodov in podobno. V sredini je pa drugi gost, to je pa Asmus Trautsch. Doktor Trautsch živi v Berlinu, študiral je kompozicijo in glasbeno teorijo, nemško književnost in filozofijo in iz te filozofije tudi doktoriral. Potem leta 2003 sta z Bettino Harc ustanovila založbo Lunardi, specializirano na zahtevno mlado literaturo. Je stalni sodelavec založbe Verlagshaus Berlin, in je pač tudi sam pesnik. Ravno zdaj, leta 2021, je izšla njegova druga pesniška zbirka. In tukaj pa je v bistvu kot vodja nekega dogodka oziroma neke ustanove, ki je pravzaprav primerljiv s Prangerjem. Namreč, če citiram, gre za Akademie für Lyrikkritik. To je, da kar povem, festival Pranger in ta Akademie sta edini specializirani ustanovi literarne kritike poezije v Evropi. Prva, torej Pranger, je nastala leta 2003, slednjo pa je 2018 v berlinski Haus für Poesie v sofinanciranju berlinskega senata ustanovil Hendrik Jackson, gost Prangerja 2013, ki je vodenje po selitvi na Moskovsko univerzo leta 2020 predal dr. Asmusu Trauttschu. Tako da imamo tukaj zdaj vodji edinih dveh res literarno-kritiško usmerjenih inštitucij v Evropi. Mogoče bi tukaj samo še omenila, to je to, kako izgleda program pri Prangerju, to pač verjetno večinoma vemo, a ne. Gre za to, da pač vsako leto 3 kritiki izberejo vsak po 3 zbirke, ki se jim zdijo zanimive in ki so izšle prejšnje leto, se pravi, da dobimo 9 zbirk in potem na samem Prangerju ljudje, torej kritiki, pretresejo vseh 9 zbirk, torej tiste, ki so jih izbrali sami in tiste, ki ste jih izbrala kolega. In seveda je zraven tudi zaželena participacija publike, participacija avtorjev in tako naprej. Potem se tudi še prevaja te izbrane pesmi v izbrane tuje jezike in tako naprej. Zdaj pa bi prosila doktorja Trautscha, da tudi on predstavi delo tele svoje akademije. In sicer mišljeno je bilo tako, da bi on odgovarjal v angleščini, zdaj, če bi bilo ravno treba biti mogoče tudi kaj pač prevedli, ampak nasplošno upam, da je že pač, da nasplošno ne bo treba, ne, pač iz angleščine prevajati. So hello, I would like to ask you now to tell something about your academy. So about its inception, its beginnings, about its goals, about its activities, maybe even publications, and so on. So the floor is yours.
Hvala, dobar dan. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Nada. Happy to be back in Slovenia, Ljubljana. Even though it's at a bit gloomy times now. The Academy for Poetry Criticism, in German Akademie für Lyrikkritik, and I think you can see the web page up there, is an institution or a project, if you will, that's embedded in the overall structure of the Haus for Poetry, Haus für Poesie in Berlin. And it was founded, so that's the inception, was founded from the Haus für Poesie together with Henrik Jackson, who's a poet and translator from Russian and activist. And he was the first director of the Academy before he stepped back and moved to Russia, to Moscow. And they asked me to be his successor, if you want. So I'm leading this Academy for Poetry Criticism since 2019, and it's an institution that has a goal to foster and support poetry criticism on various ranges, like in various media and various fields, and to give not necessarily young, but let's say non-established poetry critics the option and the chance to discuss standards, criteria, and perspectives of poetry criticism and literature criticism in general together in workshops with experts from poetry criticism, from in general from literature, but also from neighboring fields, and then to present their findings, to present their own critiques of books or single poems or poets, and the idea is a little bit that the presentation that, normally you think, well, if you think of a poetry or general literature review, you think of a text not too long, maybe 1 page or so or less, that's printed in a newspaper or maybe in a literary magazine. But through digitization, there has been a kind of extension of what poetry criticism can mean. Of course, I think that's in all countries, that you have something like book blogs and web pages where people can just comment, and even like on social media, people comment on poetry. And if you, for instance, look to the phenomenon of social media poetry, which in many aspects is not the avant-garde poetry that we're used to read, there's something like an incredible amount of response, right? There are some poets who who get like for one poem like 100,000 of likes and lots of comments. So even that might be a form of at least response or basic form of poetry criticism. But of course, there are also advanced forms, and we thought that's interesting to also put the critic in a position that she or he is seen and can present or is heard with their voice, and that the poetry critics can also use other media than whatever 1,500 characters text or so. Can have very short text, very long text, but also can have podcasts maybe. And in the first part of the Academy, we focused on a. I can also make a pause, or should I continue? I mean, no, sure. Yeah, we decided, or back then Hendrik decided to experiment with a form that's called Pecha Kucha. I'm not sure how much it is known. He was originally invented by some architects or architectural theorists in Tokyo in Japan. And it's very simple. It's you see 20 pictures that are all projected for exactly 20 seconds, and then they change. So altogether it's 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And during the projection of these 20 pictures, there's a lecture or a speech or maybe poetry. So, and they were invited to use exactly that time, which somehow mirrors the time that you may read a long poetry critique in a newspaper in a high-class news outlet. So, and at the moment we're experimenting with videos and also lecture performances, so that if you think of something like a TED Talk or so, that the critiques are on the stage and actually talk about a volume of poetry or even several or other ways poetry is published, or record their own critique as a video, because also in some countries vlogs or like critiques as video on YouTube or Vimeo and so on become more popular. So the idea of the Academy basically is to support, because also in Germany we have not so many, we have actually very, very few critics who focus on poetry. And then there are some literature critics who also do poetry, and lots of literature critics who basically don't review poetry. So there's definitely a need to support poetry criticism and also to give it a professional, in comparison to, let's say, very, very, some blogs or maybe social media comments where people just utter their opinion. Of course, criticism is something that you have to think through, and so the Academy is a little bit like gives a forum to discuss and try out ways of talking critically about poetry in various forms and use various media in order to promote that criticism.
So I assume that this recourse to such media as, let's say, the video and so on, were probably increased with the pandemic. I would assume. I mean, not only in Germany but also elsewhere, because I think that lots of things are moving online now, and I assume that such formats as, let's say, the video format or Pecha Kucha are perhaps on the increase now.
Yeah, I mean, with Pecha Kuchas, the idea is basically that you have a live situation. Like here, you can imagine, like, we are sitting at the table, and then there are 20 pictures projected for 20 seconds, and you or I or Urška, we are like talking for 6 minutes. But of course, you can also record that. And when the pandemic hit in all of us in 2020, we had already some events planned with the Academy, and we said, okay, either we have to cancel them or we have to move online because we can't do this live with audience. So and then of course something like Pecha Kucha is easy to, it's anyway like automatically produced change of pre-produced pictures, so that's not the problem. And then you can just record the audio instead of a live speech. So that was not too difficult. And then, of course, we all get used to video formats like Zoom and so on, and Teams, and you can also use that to have entretien, to have a discussion with the participants. And then I also thought that if you think of all the video platforms, especially YouTube, that actually in some fields reach much more audience than, like, let's say, classical materials. Sometimes, it can be very low at the same time, but sometimes you have someone is talking about a poem, it can have thousands of views, whereas like, let's say in a textbook, if it's maybe a very popular textbook, it could be the same, but very often it's just a smaller amount of people watching that. And on the other hand, there's also a low threshold for people to engage with such a video, right? I mean, if it's of course the whole problem of all that is private capitalist platforms that have their own algorithms, so they're probably not trained to promote poetry very much. But in principle, you could just reach basically everyone who has any kind of smartphone, computer, whatever, connected to the internet. And of course also the technology that you need in order to produce something like a video has decreased, whereas like, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, you had to buy a camera and then had to maybe transform the format and so on. And now you can just use your phone and even the microphones are okay, and just follow a few rules in terms of light and perspective, and then you can just upload that for free. And so that I think supported not sure whether that's an explosion, but the extension of people working with this format in order to talk about poetry.
So do you notice this tendency also in other countries? Because you are very internationally oriented, I think. For example, the focus of the Academy is often on non-German speaking countries such as Turkey, Italy, Russia, the UK. So I assume that those countries are also taking more and more advantage of these other means of communication, of visual means of communication, or online communication.
Yeah, it varies a bit. So the idea was, my idea was also to you probably think we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but I mean, I think at least in a language like German, that it's spoken by, I don't know, 100 million more than people, it seems that also the critique of literature is a little bit bound to the own language. I mean, of course, the translations are part of the objects of literary criticism, but then it means the original work has already been translated, and then critique will focus on it. But as I know, as a poet and also participant of discourses on poetry and the arts and politics in general in Germany, I know that there are some discourses, and it's not necessarily said that these discourses that might be quite interesting are kind of echoed or reflected in other countries with other languages, because only if you have a book and then you have a translator who's interested and a publishing house and so forth, the critique in another country will be aware of that. And that's very often, as you know probably, and it can come with a huge delay. So, but we thought, okay, what's actually going on in our fellow befriended European nations in terms of poetry critique and review, even though it might not be translated, maybe there are authors that still need to be discovered. So we had some contact with an expert from Poland, Russia, and as you mentioned, other countries, Italy, Sweden, and so forth. And it was really interesting to understand what are people connected to poetry and literature in general talking about at the moment. Are there frontiers? Are there different parties, so to speak? Or how diverse is the scene? And what are the issues people are dealing with? And there are sometimes, or I would say this is really interesting because there's a lot that is similar, I would say, at least in the European countries. We look deeper into, but also there are particular differences. And now in terms of the formats, my feeling, and I have to very consciously say my feeling because I don't have statistics on that, but that all these, platforms and new media tend to come from Anglo-Saxon countries, especially the United States. So which means that, for instance, in the UK, the openness to work with vlogs, like video blogs, or with different forms of digital magazines has been more popular earlier than in countries going more to Central Europe, including Germany. But of course, you're right, because digitization is something that's global, and we're all in dealing with that, and also the pandemic actually forced people to use digital means. It's something that also in other countries people are open to. But I would say that what happens everywhere, basically, in all the countries we looked into, is like discussions on poetry in digital magazines. Sometimes very low threshold. Sometimes, I think in Russia, there's one magazine you don't even have to have a proper account of. So it's like social media. You can just, discuss and talk and type. And sometimes you have to do, have to kind of be assigned by editors, but it's actually very low-key. You can just enter a discussion and also publish your own poetry. And that is very interesting. That has tremendously increased in all countries we've looked into. Also in Sweden, Magnus William Olsson, Swedish critic and poet, told us that there's like, I don't know how many thousand poems are published every month. So for sure it's not a competition with Slovenia. You will always be number one, I guess, but or number two with Iceland. But it really increased the awareness and the production of writing something. In which ways it's poetry or good poetry is probably another question, but I mean, it's a great, not sure whether to call it boom, but at least digitization helped people to just, not feel the threshold to say, oh my God, poetry, and I have to be a poet and publish a book, but maybe I have something, I just type into an open magazine or social media, people comment on it, and then it's starting already some discourse. And in terms of all the videos, Pecha Kucha, podcasts, audios, blogs, and so on, I think there are still some differences, and it's probably more widespread in United States and Canada and UK than in Poland, for instance, but I say this with care. I'm trying to be a bit careful because I don't have numbers on that, so that's just a general impression.
Yeah, of course, thank you. While we are on the subject of international poetry reception, how much do the standards for good poetry, so to speak, how much do they vary from country to country? I mean, does each country have its own have its own special preferences? For example, if you look at what is considered good literature in Germany, for instance, would the suggestions or the overall style, the approach in other countries be very different as far as you were able to tell from these vlogs and so on, or do you think that there is a general agreement on what is interesting these days?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very difficult question because, and of course, now it gets very diversified. So as a general answer, I would first say that the standards to judge poetry are already diversified in our societies. I mean, I can tell that from Germany for sure that we have a wider range of what poetry, contemporary poetry is like. And some might be called more traditional or more language-oriented, experimental, more political or more nature writing, whatever. But often these categories overlap, and it's hard to distinguish. So, and of course, there's a discourse that has some criteria that are not necessarily written down, but that probably imply some kind of complexity, some kind of density, some kind of engagement with the world in a complex way. So to pay basically that poetry is something that creates something new through language. That's not just mirroring something that's already there, just writing it down, but creating something even with new words, and also is open to complex feelings, emotions, impressions like ambivalence and so on. So there, I would say in general there's the perspective that poetry is something that on the one hand should be kind of direct and touch you and reach you directly without having without implying that you have to be a literary scholar to get close to it. You may even not have to understand it, you just have to enjoy it in some way. But on the other hand, it also challenges you with some complexity. But of course, if you hear that and you read a poem, how to apply that? So it gets then always very concrete and specific in order to deal with particular poems. And in other countries, I have the feeling that it's more or less the same, but then it starts to get tricky because, of course, all the countries have also other traditions. For instance, in Poland, or let's say maybe Russia, it's an interesting case example. I mean, like let's say in comparison to whatever, Italy or France or UK, the Eastern European countries, of course, and you know that very well in Slovenia as well, have made the other experiences, especially before 1990 and also after 1990. And of course, then it's not just West and East, but it's also the countries are different. And for instance, in Russia, that's what we learned in a workshop with a Russian expert, Kirill Korshagin, is that many Russian poets still work also with the aspect of war, because in contrary to Slovenia and Germany and other countries, there were wars and still are going on, like in the Donbass, in Ukraine, in Chechnya and so on. And that's something that's an issue, even though the poets are not necessarily affected directly, like they're not soldiers or so, but that's an issue for them, the destruction and the violence and the suffering that's going on from these wars. Whereas, that's something we may, look into in history or to other places, but it's not something that happens here, right? So, long answer, that's still not really an answer. But so if you look more closely to the details, you think, okay, digitization, diverse society, there are common issues, common criteria that poetry has to pay justice to these developments. But at the same time, it can be very specific and has also to do with the reception. For instance, in Poland, that language poetry was read by some avant-garde poets in the 90s a lot, and also in Germany, but maybe not in other countries. So there's also different backgrounds, and that also has an effect on the way that poetry criticism judges poetry from today. But as a baseline, I would say poetry is as diverse as societies can be, so there's not the standard of judging poetry.
And perhaps it's the other countries, so the surrounding countries, that actually notice the characteristics of a certain poetry, of a certain culture more perceptively than that culture does itself. Because, for example, when you mentioned the theme of war and so on, probably that's something that is more noticeable to other countries, to other readers than to the readers, to the audiences in that particular country. Perhaps it's also perhaps it's also good to have this outside position to be able to assess what's going on and to see these common denominators.
Yeah, and just like to add one footnote, it's interesting. I mean, of course, I would say not generally. It's easier, maybe. Of course, I would always say that people in one region, culture, country have their own perspective and experiences, and are very, they're privileged to understand what they are occupied with. But of course, it's always sometimes helpful to get a view from the outside and also notice the alineations and so on. And especially also interesting, that was to say, if your own poetry is translated to another language, which kind of poetry do the translators select, or the publishers in another country? And I think, like in some countries, for instance, in Italy, I think it's the German poets, contemporary poets, that within Germany are rather, are highly respected, but are rather, whatever that might mean, working with a tradition more, that are, for instance, stronger in Italy, whereas they don't translate so much the more experimental literature. So it's also interesting to see through the lens of other languages to your own literature.
Yeah, just as an example, as far as I remember, it was said that in Russia, for instance, this tradition of rhyming, of using metrics and rhyme is very strong. So to the extent that even free verse is translated sometimes into rhymed verse in Russian, which is, I think this is not really the case in most other countries. Like for example, in Slovenia, there is the opposite tendency. So to translate even rhymed poetry as free verse in order to get all the nuances of meaning right, and in Russia it's just the other way around. So that's also yeah.
Če smem, jaz bom v slovenščini, Asmus bo razumel ali pa mu bomo kasneje povedali. Gre za to vprašanje različnih občutkov za to, kaj je dobra poezija, ne? Ali pa kakšna poezija je v neki določeni v trenutku in času, bi morala reči, dobro sprejeta. Jaz se spomnim, leta 2004 smo pri reviji Literatura naredili specialno številko oziroma blog z naslovom Mlada nemška poezija. Jaz sem jo uvedla kot kuratorka z citatom Lucije Stupica, da pa ona politične poezije pa nikoli ne bi mogla pisati. Iz razloga, ker je v mladi nemški poeziji takrat, ki sem jo jaz pač dala prevesti med prevajalce in dala noter, bilo veliko razmisleka o političnih temah. Danes ima literatura je v eni drugi fazi, ne, pa tudi slovenska poezija, kjer recimo se ukvarja z angažirano okoljsko tematiko na prepišnem uredništvu. Tako da to je bilo takrat recimo pač tega 20 let skoraj nazaj. Bi pa rekla to, kar je Asmus rekel, da, ali pa tudi Nada, da včasih od zunaj bolj vidimo, kakšna je neka, ne vem, se nam zdi neka specifika. V Nemčiji ali pa v nemškem jezikovnem področju bojo vedeli tudi kolegi, ki so danes tukaj specializirani za nemščino, je tradicija pisanja poezije in okus zelo različno se mi zdi v Avstriji, Nemčiji, mogoče Švici niti ne toliko, ampak recimo znotraj nemškega okolja celotnega obstajajo tako imenovani, ne vem, kako temu rečemo, neke skupine estetske, ne? Tisti, ki so bliže recimo izhodiščnemu jeziku, danščini, norveščini, švedščini, jih bolj zanima ta vrsta, ta način poezije, ki razgrajuje jezik. Anja Utla and so on. Razgrajujejo jezik in enako avstrijska, eksperimentalna, se temu reče, ne, poezija. Potem so pa zelo, zelo močni, recimo berlinski krog je bil slog založbe Cookbooks, ne, ki je malo v tem, da je zelo težko je prevedljiv, ne, ti slogi so zelo težko prevedljivi, ker se igrajo tudi z etimološkimi posamičnostmi nekega jezika. In znotraj slovenščine imamo tudi različne šole, ne? Šole, ki prevajajo še vedno rimano, če je rimano v originalu. Šole, ki ne prevajajo rimano, če je rimano v originalu, striktno, ne? In te raznolikosti pač ena zraven druge sobivajo. Mi smo opazili pri Prangerju v vseh teh letih prevajanja v te tuje jezike in v soočanju z tujimi gosti. Ravno to, recimo, ko smo imeli 5 let, ko Danska, Švedska, Nizozemska, Norveška, je bil to nek slog poezije, ki je v slovenščini tako rekoč ni bilo. bolj racionalna, bolj, mislim, kaj pa nikakor ne rimana, ne, v tem smislu, ali pa na neke druge eksperimentalne načine skupaj dana. Ne. To sem hotela reči.
Ja, to se dobro spomnim, ko smo imeli Skandinavce, ne, več let pač zapovrstjo in to je izgledalo tako, da pač seveda tukaj smo govorili o slovenskih zbirkah, ki pa jih je bilo treba pač posamezne pesmi prevesti v izbrani jezik, ne, se pravi švedščino, norveščino, danščino in zmeraj so pa tudi prišli pač kot gostje neki pesniki, ki so bili recimo švedski, danski ali pa recimo norveški in tam se je prav opazilo, kako drugačne so te njihove pesmi od pravzaprav pesmi, ki so jih pisali slovenski pesniki in ki so bile pač zastopane v teh 9 zbirkah izbranih. To je bila prav izrazito ena razlika v pristopu.
Tu en stavek mogoče, en najbolj eklatanten primer za to, da je pri nas recimo Tomaž Šalamun bil zelo cenjen in spoštovan in tudi zelo, zelo bran v vseh teh naših generacijah odraščajočih. On je imel izjemne težave in ima še zdaj pač posthumno težave najti bralce v nemščini, ker ta tip poezije ne pride tako rekoč nikamor. Podobno je z delčki, pač dostikrat, ko vidimo, kdo je v Sloveniji zelo, zelo bran, kako v nemščini sploh ne funkcionira ali pa se čuti, ne vem, mi smo še pred 15 leti zelo dosti ene take postbitniške poezije imeli, ne vem, pripovedna, tak parlando pripovedne. To pač ni zanimivo, se mi zdi, za dobršen del nemške literarne scene, zato, ker so imeli recimo take pesnike že v 60. in 70. letih. Tako da te tradicije presajanja, tu treba pač biti zelo, zelo previden in tudi velike založbe, o tem bomo mogoče v nadaljevanju še kaj povedali, za poezijo samo nemške založbe, razen te velike antologije, ki je napovedana pri založbi Hanser, jaz ne vidim, vem, da je Surkamp prebral Anjo Golob, pa se ni odločil, in je še vedno pri tej mali založbi z Dunaja. Zelo, zelo težko je, ne? To, kar je nam všeč, da bi pol bilo pač tudi Nemcem, Dancem ali pa Francozom ali pa komu drugemu všeč.
No, mogoče bi ravno na to navezala tudi neko naslednje vprašanje, pač ki je za oba, namreč kako sprejemajo literaturo, konkretno slovensko literaturo, nemški ali pa avstrijski bralci, recimo kateri so priljubljeni avtorji, slovenski avtorji v Nemčiji ali Avstriji in tudi konec koncev, kako je z dvojezičnimi izdajami. So this is a question for both. How are translations of literature, and more specifically of Slovenian literature, received by German or Austrian audiences, as far as you have been able to see? And which foreign, especially Slovenian authors, are most popular? Are there any poets among them? So maybe if you can tell something about this. And Urška also.
Willst du zuerst?
Kann ich. First of all, thank you for the question. It's of course hard to say. So there's a certain percentage of translations that are part of German book market. I think overall books, it's like more or less 13% are translations, and of that 13%, roughly 12 to 13% or 14% are first editions, first publications. But I think in terms of belletristic, it's a bit more. But it's very the amount of Slovene literature translated into German every year is so small that it's not even in the statistics of the first, I think, 20 languages or so. Of course, there are many languages, right? But I mean, there's, for instance, more translated from Polish or so, or Russian and Italian and of course, but there are of course still like lots of Slovene authors that have been translated mainly, and I think I wasn't sure whether you were talking about that, Urška, but often they are published in Austrian publishing houses, and some of them also in German. Theory, philosophy a bit more in German publishing houses, but poetry and also other belletristic prose is very much in Austrian houses. And of course, I heard that you mentioned Thomas Salomon. He's of course very highly respected and loved by many in German poetry. Ale Stenger is well known and received, and there's others. I mean, I'm not sure really. I mean, of course, Drago Janša is like one of the great names. Florian Lipusch, Ivan Šanka, of course, is already old. So these are names. Uroš Šupan also, I would say, is received. But then there's, to my feeling, there's not like the literary star. You know, there's not someone who's people are always aware what she or he is publishing, maybe apart from Slavoj Žižek. He's really a star in Germany, but he's of course a philosopher. So there are names. My impression is that there's Marusha Krese, Anja Goller, but mostly are men. So I see here in the audience, we are almost, apart from me, it's mostly or almost all female, but in terms of what are the big names, even in translation, unfortunately it's almost, not exclusively, but definitely mainly male names. Maybe also apart from Alenka Čupančić, who's of course again rather theory than belletristic. So there is an awareness, but I'm not sure whether you talked about that. My feeling is that because most of them are published in Austrian publishing houses, that also their own marketing capacity and maybe even readings and discussions take place in Austria or are more focused on the Austrian market. In general, it's a German-speaking market encompassing Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, the German-speaking part of Switzerland. But the bigger publishing houses, the more, of course, it can also do some marketing and basically put their books in all, make sure that all the bookshops have their books, like Surkamp, whereas a smaller, let's say, a publishing house from Klagenfurt or so, or Salzburg, is not necessarily capable of doing that. So that's my impression, that there's lots of Slovene literature translated, but I'm not so sure about the numbers. Big names get reviews, but I think it's not that there are like millions sold. So.
I would
Sorry, maybe
argue with that.
Okay, please.
Asmus pravi, da so pač velike nemške založbe bolj sposobne delati velik marketing. There's an example of a book being published by Wallstein, a translation of Mojca Kumerdej, a big name, a big translator and so on. The book was totally unnoticed, I think. But then the same translator by Googles, as a small, a good Berlin verlag, has been noticed. But
that's...
Yeah.
No, just to say, there's, of course, I didn't mean that, the Austrians can't do much marketing, but of course, many German publishers, even though they're big names, they don't do that. So, and it doesn't mean that you have a book in Wallstein or Schöffling or whatever, or Schöffling is not even so big, but let's say Surkamp or Hansa, and necessarily it's going to be successful. No. And especially, and that's because you mentioned small ones, they are also like Hocho, who published a book by Anja Golob, and other small publishing houses, Wunderhorn, for example, they also did one of the only existing 2 anthologies of Slovene poetry, which is, I think, a disaster. That's such an amazing poetry country, and we have only 2 anthologies in German. One of them is Wunderhorn. And to mention others, if they publish a book, they put more, let's say, passion into every book. So if they decide to publish someone, they are small, but they can do a lot. I just meant like also a small German publishing house probably can't do lots of events in let's say, Klagenfurt. And a small Klagenfurt publisher probably can't do lots of events all over Germany.
Je pa to pač zadeva, o kateri so na javni agenciji za knjigo v zadnjih letih ogromno razmišljali in so tudi pač čisto jasno povedali, kako želijo, da je. Mislim, da se je z letošnjim letom to spremenilo. Namreč, da avstrijske založbe, sploh pa slovenske avstrijske založbe, preprosto niso bile uspešne na razpisih za nemške prevode slovenskih avtorjev in se tudi potem niso s časoma več potegovale. Z razlogom je bilo rečeno, da pač, ko ti greš v Berlinu ali pa Frankfurtu, ne vem, Kölnu, v neko knjigarno, teh knjig tam ni, ne, ker pač niso del te neke knjigotrške mreže. Še marsikatere druge seveda knjige ni, tudi če je pri veliki nemško-nemški, zvezno-nemški založbi. Tako da se bo videlo, kako bo s tem. Hkrati pa jaz mislim, da kot je primer Anje Golob, Edition Korrespondenzen je majhna, ali pa Edition Korrespondenzen je zelo majhna založba, ampak ima strašno dober rating, je sicer z Dunaja, ampak pride v vse, ko bi rekla, antologije in pomembne izbore. You mentioned Žižek, Zupančič, and also Dular.
Yeah. But his great book on voice, his master's voice, was published in Surkamp, but I'm not sure whether it's still available. So it's especially Žižek and Zupančič. And but also, for instance, Rastko Močnik. I think he's one of the group that also work with Žižek a lot and so on. And I haven't found any book by him translated into German. So there's also, it's not like that all the theory is translated, but it's just single names.
Mogoče bi samo omenila, zdaj pač, ko je Frankfurt pač priprava na Frankfurt 2023, ne, tole, kar se tiče subvencioniranja in podobno prevodov slovenske poezije v nemščino, to pač ima zdaj javna agencija za knjigo že mislim od leta 2017 prav en poseben razpis, ki je samo za prevod, torej ena stvar je seveda tisti pač vsakoletni razpis za prevod slovenske književnosti v tuje jezike, ampak zdaj od leta 2017 je pa še prav posebej za prevod slovenske književnosti v nemščino. In tukaj je pač zanimivo gledati potem, kdo se prijavi in kaj. In recimo nekaj let v okviru tega sploh dejansko ni bila financirana skoraj nobena pesniška zbirka in sicer potem smo pač vprašali, kako je do tega prišlo, ne, in je bil odgovor na javni agenciji za knjigo, da je problem v tem, da se založbe preprosto ne prijavijo, da je tudi mogoče mislijo, da namreč to bi se morala prijaviti ta tuja založba, ne, recimo nemška, avstrijska, pri kateri bi to izšlo in da mogoče enostavno pač smatrajo, da ni dovolj interesa, ampak da recimo to, kar vidimo, je pretežno proza, ne pa toliko poezija. Zdaj recimo eno tako res veliko delo, ki je pač, za katerega izdajatelji so zaprosili za subvencijo in ki bo pač izšlo zdaj v kakšnem letu, je tale velika antologija Nachbar auf der Wolke, se pravi Sosed na oblaku. To je res neka taka velika antologija slovenske poezije, bolj to 20. 21. stoletje. Bilo je še par posameznih zbirk, ampak to recimo res nekako ni tako neka prioriteta, tukaj pri pripravah na Frankfurt, se mi zdi.
Ne vem, če ni prioriteta na pripravah za Frankfurt, ampak vsekakor moramo govoriti o tem, da ima poezija, jaz mislim, da v Sloveniji drugačen status kot v nemških državah, nemških, that the poetry is actually being on the margin a little bit in German countries. Although it's very alive. Slovenci pa pač res imamo zelo radi. Res je, da se ne sposoja, to moramo reči, se ne sposoja, ampak še vedno se tiska. So tudi uredniki tukaj založb, ki še vedno tiskajo in to zelo izbrane, zelo naporno prevedene in tako naprej, velike izdaje, kot so Kancionere pri Gogi. To se še vedno počne in jaz mislim, da nemški založniki pač ne iščejo specifično slovenskih pesnikov in pesnic zelo na novo. Iščejo avtorice in avtorje romanov, ki bi bili zelo brani ali pa ki bi bili potem tudi avtorice, avtori sposobni lepo nastopati, ki bi bili en čas, vem, da je Renata Zamida prepovedala, da si želijo nemški založniki razmeroma mlade avtorice, pač tip avtorja. Ženska avtorica, ki piše zelo, zelo dobre romane. Zdaj imamo enih par takih prevodov je nastalo v zadnjih 3 letih. Točno to se je iskalo na nemškem trgu. Poezija, pa če se danes samo pač v resnici o poeziji, pa malo še o humanistiki pogovarjamo, je nišna zadeva in ne vem, če bo bistveno drugačna, razen te velike antologije, ki bo išla, pri čemer si omenila, Nada, to financiranje. Mene je zelo začudilo, razen če bo potem bistveno več financiranja še prišlo, ampak to, da taka antologija dobi, ne vem, 10.000 evrov, to je zelo primerljivo z eno čist navadno slikanico, ki izide v tujem jeziku in dobi enako 10.000 evrov. To je zelo, zelo malo, razen če bo, kot rečeno, potem še kaj prišlo.
Ja, to je zanimivo, recimo o tem profilu avtorja, ki je zaželen pač za prevajanje, pač tukaj se res vidi po mojem, da gre tukaj za marketinške, tudi za marketinška vprašanja, pač avtor, ki je živ, ki je dejaven, ki lahko hodi okrog in pač se sam promovira in ki je tudi recimo, ne vem, atraktiven na nek način, kot pač neke mlajše ženske. To se po mojem res tukaj pozna tudi ta misel na marketing. Ampak bi pa potem, ja, tukaj v tej zvezi bi še tole vprašala, govorili smo tudi omenili smo, recimo humanistiko, kaj je zanimivo v humanistiki. Pa me zanima, katera slovenska dela stvarne literature in esejistike bi bila recimo zanimiva v Nemčiji, se pravi, katera slovenska dela bi bila zanimiva za Nemčijo, katere teme živo zanimajo nemško javnost. Namreč recimo, če pogledamo na spletno stran JAK, vidimo, da je leta 2020 podprla prevod ene konkretne humanistične etnološke knjige, ki je izšla ravno tukaj na ZRC SAZU, v katere Atriju smo zdaj. In sicer to je naslov Venček domačih, predmeti Slovencem sveti, in sicer gre pa za eseje, za neke recimo raziskave o gibanici, potem o harmoniki, o vaški situli, o kranjski klobasi. To recimo je bilo podprto. Kaj bi bilo pa še kaj tazga zanimivega, bi mogoče vprašala zdaj še Asmusa. In addition to imaginative literature, Slovenia has a lot of non-fiction to offer. What kind of non-fiction and what themes might be interesting for the German public? For example, one book that was subsidized in 2020 was a book about the so-called sacred Slovenian objects, such as the carniolan sausage or the gibanica cake and situla of vače, the accordion. So what themes do you think might be interesting, non-literary themes might be interesting for the German public?
Yeah, difficult to say. I mean, on the one hand, we mentioned already earlier Zupancic, Žižek, and others, so Dola and so on. So philosophy, psychoanalysis, and psychology have like a lot of output that comes from Slovenia to the German market and is well received. But I think apart from maybe Zupancic, for sure Žižek, who sells also books to the general public, it's more an academic or intellectual endeavor, so it's not like that you sell a lot. And if it comes to general non-fiction books, I'm not sure, to be honest, whether it makes sense to think so much whether, for instance, it makes sense to translate some cookbooks, or so it could be, but maybe it's like what's really specific that Slovenian non-fiction book authors want to offer. And it can be also something new that actually surprises the German public. I mean, I can just say that obviously, books on animals and on food, but also on like travel guides, even though in the last year due to Corona, the travel books on other countries, the revenue decreased by 21 or 22%. So that's at the moment it's a difficult field. But people are open to ecological topics, and of course are curious to learn also about the history and the political situation of other countries. And so I could imagine that many still don't really know enough about the history, also Yugoslavian history, and then how the relationship of Slovenia with Austria, but also then with the neighboring countries of former Yugoslavia really happened. But to be honest, I'm not an agent and can't just really project what will be successful. My feeling is at least that because your country has such a rich and really admirable tradition of writing fiction and non-fiction, that it's rather that you put something to the German market and say, look here, that's what we are doing. Enjoy that. And I don't know a topic that would necessarily not work. And then of course there are topics in terms of, for instance, diversity, feminism, and so on, that are question of people of color, persons of color, that is also quite now. I don't want to call popular, but that's kind of at stake at the moment, German market. But maybe that's not something that comes so much from Slovenia.
Jaz sem pri tem vprašanju si dovolila malo nezaslišano stvar narediti, ker so slabe prognoze. Obstaja lestvica najbolj priljubljenih del stvarne literature, se pravi, tako kot je best of. 30 nemških kritikov in novinarjev izbira literaturo, leposlovje, pa tudi stvarno literaturo. In to je potem Sachbuchbestenliste CDF. Od 10, ki so recimo na tej lestvici knjig stvarne literature, sta samo 2 prevoda. Se pravi, Nemci najraje berejo kar direktno nemške avtorje stvarne literature v nemščini in sicer s temami, recimo, kraljevska družina, Hohenzollernji in nacizem. Potem biti sam o samoti. Potem kako je, to je pa prvi prevod je iz angleščine in drugi prevod je tudi iz angleščine. Kako, en je iz okoljske teme in drugi je iz teme o Judih. Potem jih zanima recimo neke sociološke teme, pozna moderna v krizi, Goethe v Italiji in iskanje Nemcev, pač Nemci so vedno zelo, temu se reče Drang nach dem Süden, se pravi, jih vleče Italija. Na primeru Goethe, to je ena stvar, potem je pa recimo še ena, ki je avtor v nemščini direktno napisal o svojem doživljanju, kako je vplivalo dolgoletno bivanje v ZDA nanj. Se pravi, zelo jih zanima pač ta Judje, ZDA, prevodi iz angleščine, pa Florian Illis, Liebe in Zeiten des Hasses. Florian Illis je pa recimo avtor enega največjih bestsellerjev stvarne literature in to je Generacion Golf, bilo pred davnimi leti. Avtor srednje generacije zelo na popularen način piše. Tako da okoljska filozofija in psihologija, to je zdaj od sedanjih teh, ki so najbolj prodajane. Potem pa obstajajo še recimo v nagradi Leipziškega knjižnega sejma Preis der Leipziger Buchmesse, kar podeljujejo od leta 2005 naprej, podeljujejo za beletristiko, prevod in stvarno literaturo. In če se pogleda, katera dela stvarne literature so nominirana v vseh teh letih od 2005 naprej, dobimo nek nabor, kaj bi Nemce lahko zanimalo. To niso prevodi, samo o temah se lahko malo pač orientiramo, to so direktne v nemščini napisane. In je spet recimo judovska Palestina, Druga svetovna vojna, Foucaultovo nihalo, potem so liberalna politična misel. Zelo take stvari, ki pokažejo pač meni tudi to, da je nemška kultura, centralna kultura po prevodoslovni misli oziroma sociološki, ne glede na to, da 26% beletristike, recimo oni prevedajo, Slovenci prevedemo 49% beletristike, ne? Od vseh naslovov polovico prevedemo, polovico napišemo sami, oni samo 26% od beletristike prevedajo. Pri stvarni literaturi jih pa še dosti manj zanima, kot vidimo, ne? Kaj zdaj nekdo drug na drugem koncu Evrope dela. Če pa že, potem pa pač ZDA oziroma iz angleščine. To je moja prognoza, podobna je pri poeziji, no? Ne glede na to, da so to naše dve naši paradni disciplini, se pravi Žižek, ki bo vedno ampak on piše direktno v angleščini, ne? In on ni pravzaprav Slovenec, že leta 2007, ko smo bili častna gostja na Leipziškem sejmu, ga nismo smeli kot Slovenca predstavljati. In je bila zelo dobro obiskana prireditev z njim. Tako da imamo kaj za pokazati, če bi pa Drago Jančar dobil Nobelovo nagrado, bi bilo pa sploh še boljš. To bi bilo pa potem enega takega, pa Vojnoviča recimo, pri Vojnoviču, ki izhaja pri majhni avstrijski založbi, pa moramo reči, da oni imajo pa zelo dober marketing. Folio hat sehr gute Marketingmaßnahmen, ja, das muss man dann auch noch dazu sagen.
Yeah, because you also Folio had also in the last Lyrikempfehlung, it says a little bit something like Pranger also has, every year, like House of Poesie, the Lyrikkritik, some publishers, and so there's a jury which selects books from the last 12 months that were published in the last year until spring of the actual year, and their official poetry recommendations. And there was also, in the last one was also Roberta Dapont by Folio Verlag. So it's especially in terms of poetry, also the small houses actually have, also in Austria, have an advantages over the big houses often. Because they are really loving what they're doing.
Ampak Folio, zdaj pravi Asmus, da so tudi znani, spravi spoštovani, ker so Roberta Dapont je, ne moremo reči italijanska, ampak piše pesnica, ki je zelo nenavadna, ker piše v izumirajočem dialektu oziroma jeziku. Wie heißt das, die Sprache nochmal? Se pravi, to je jezik, ki se govori v severni Italiji nad približno 2000 nadmorskimi metri po različnih dolinah. To je zelo, zelo nekaj nenavadnega. Mislim, da se reče valiz, ne? To je zelo nenavadna stvar, ampak Roberta Dapont, recimo pri Foliu, ker Folio je en del tudi v Dolomitih domuje, v Bocnu, ne. Ampak Folio ne zanima slovenska poezija, zanimivo, ne. Oni imajo Slovence, so imeli že Blatnika, imajo Vojnoviča, imajo Jančarja, tradicionalno vsa ta leta, poezije pa ne. Slovenske.
By way of conclusion, I would like to ask if maybe you have any suggestions as to what Slovenia might do to promote its poetry more. I mean, is it even possible, considering that poetry is such a really small niche thing? Or do you think that something could still be done? If you have any suggestions.
Now, of course, the Germans, or some Germans, like to call their country the country of poets and thinkers. And you have to really put the inverted commas, because I guess Slovenia is much more a country of poets and thinkers than Germany. We don't treat our poetry that well, which means it's not sold so much. But on the other hand, there is definitely something that's often described as a boom, starting in the 90s, especially in the 2000s. More and more, not only write poetry, but also small publishing houses open that actually create attraction and the awareness, for instance, in the digital space, in social media. And some people even think it's cool just to buy their T-shirts or whatever, or bags. And also magazines, online magazines were established in that period, and so there is let's say a great movement of poets, editors, translators, publishers, mediators that promote poetry, and there's also support programs, mainly public money support programs that and institutions like the House for Poetry, Lyrikkritik, and others, and even like now a called network. It's a Netzwerk Lyrik, a network of poetry within Germany, but also Austria, Switzerland. And there was a big conference in Munich this September where the first time literary scholars dealing with poetry from Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, and also the poets came together and worked for a week. And so there's a lot. I would say it's a great flourishing situation on the one hand, and on the other hand, only a few poets really sell very well. For instance, Jan Wagner won the Preis der Leipziger Buchmesse, I think 2015 or so, with one book, Regenton-Variation, and that went up to, I don't know, 35 or 40,000 sold copies in that time. not sure whether the number is correct, but that's not a number that even famous poets normally reach. So there's a discrepancy between, the amount of sold copies and the fame, or the also lots of, Monika Ring, for instance, who worked on a translation of Thomas Salomon. She's one of the greatest poets we have, and she won lots of prizes, but it doesn't mean that she sells like 100,000 copies or so. And that's now, this being said, there is a great awareness for poetry in some discourses in Germany, and of course also in Austria for sure. They have much more tradition in focusing on language, and to some extent, of course, also in Switzerland. And so I think because Slovenia has such a great variety of poetry, and also really so interesting avant-garde poetry, and also a variety. I mean, this is just absolutely astounding. Like a small country, with not so many inhabitants, and who also speak other languages so well. It's a great poetic tradition, and it's not only a feeling, but it's just objectively the case that it's absolutely underrepresented in the German discourse. So we need definitely a great actual anthology. For instance, there was one of the Lyrikempfehlungen, the lyric recommendations recently was a book by contemporary Danish poetry. And of course, Danish poetry is also great, but that was okay, there's a book, and then there are readings and reviews and so on. I think we need a great anthology of contemporary or modern Slovene poetry, and of course also a direct contact between all the smaller publishing houses. Verlagshaus Berlin, Cook, Wunderhorn, Hochrot, Verbrecher Verlag just published Natascha Kramberger. So there's also an awareness of small publishing houses, but still they have almost no Slovene authors. So I think and then of course then the question is who makes the connection. That's not difficult, right? We are like neighbors and open and friends, but it's often individuals who work on that. Like Urško has done so much, and then unfortunately, someone like Fabian Hafner, who did so much for mediating Slovene literature into German, died much young, in a young age. And then someone who's also translated a lot, like Klaus Detlev Olof, is already of high age. So I think it's important to also have new translators, and also involve young people to translate, and then to have direct contact to these publishing houses, editors, newspapers, and yeah, I'm happy to help. And for the book fair, it's of course then the question, if an economist would not even consider poetry as something, say, okay, the only thing that really can sell a lot is novels, not even stories. For sure, no theater, not essays, poetry, no, novels. So, and then of course you probably have big names. Maybe you ask Peter Handke or so to support a few names, and then these are the stars at the book fair. But I think it would be even much more interesting to promote what the richness and variety of Slovene literature and poetry in particular, and also give the German audience something to learn. Say, okay, maybe look to Slovene poetry, maybe you can also become even more aware of what's going on in poetry, and plus non-fiction books, theory, and so on, and of course prose. You have all the variety, including theater. So I think that would be recommended, to work with mediators and translators. And maybe the last thing is some small countries like Iceland, Norway, who were guests at the book fair, they sometimes developed interesting programs, like I think the Norwegians, they all arrived by train with a princess. I'm not sure whether that was really helpful, but at least there's some performance ideas of how to promote, how to create media awareness, and it has become a little bit easy, I think, using digital means and social media. But I think it's important to mediate, and I'm very happy to support any endeavor that makes Slovene poetry more widespread, also, in the focus of the Academy.
Yeah,
that's
thank
right.
Thank you very much. By way of conclusion, I would simply like to draw attention to the fact that that Urška is also in charge of the so-called Pranger Lyrikbook, which is actually doing just this, trying to promote, trying to network and to promote Slovene literature, especially poetry, abroad in other countries. This is a process, a project that is going on, and I think that it is already in operation quite in quite a lively way, because I think that I remember you were saying that you, for example, you collected all the e-addresses or the names of the sites where various translations of Slovene poetry into probably Spanish or other languages as well can be reached.
Lyrikbook je mlad projekt, ki se je rodil z željo, da delamo to mreženje in da predvsem poberemo skupaj, kar smo pri Prangerju prevedli od leta 2006 naprej v poljščino, ruščino, nemščino, mislim, da celo angleščine še ni zraven, tako da to še lahko, v vse skandinavske jezike, v vse iberske jezike,
v retoromanščino, ja, švicarsko retoromanščino, ker pri retoromanščini je treba povedati, a je italijanska in tako naprej. In smo potem zbrali mednarodno in albanščino, recimo mednarodno ekipo, ki so brali literarnih kritikov, ki so brali te jezike direktno, ne, se pravi, in nemščino. Zbrali smo in je vsak prebral tiste pesnike, ki so v tistem letu bili na Prangerju v teh prevodih in jih je rangiral potem, kakor je on ali ona mislil, da bi imeli šanso v nemškem okolju. Tako da so zelo zanimive, drugačne izbire prišle ven. Recimo Brane Senegačnik je bil zelo, kdo drug, ki preden je za Brane dobil lani nagrado, ne, to je bilo pred 2 letoma. Marsikaj potem vidijo, česar mi ne vidimo, ne, ali pa ne vem, se jim zdi zanimivo, ali so pa tisti prevodi boljši, recimo. Pač, mi smo imeli enega selektorja, ki bere čisto vse skandinavske jezike in nemščino in je tudi zelo zanimive stvari. To bomo še predstavili, kolikor bo seveda poezija v pripravah na Frankfurt 2023 imela, kako bi rekla, priložnosti, ne, strani odločevalcev na javni agenciji za knjigo, bomo vedeli. Če ne bomo pa sami. Ja, hvala lepa. Torej, res hvala obema sogovornikoma za tako poglobljene, za res tako poglobljene, naštudirane odgovore, podprte z pač statistikami, dejstvi, osebnimi izkušnjami. Jaz bi pa zdaj tukaj na tej točki vprašala, če bi mogoče bi imel še kdo kakšno vprašanje, kakšen komentar za katerega od sogovornikov iz publike. No, je res, da smo tudi že mečkano dolgi mogoče, tako da, če ni nobenih komentarjev, nobenih vprašanj, bi se vam jaz lepo zahvalila za to, da ste prišli oziroma da ste spremljali ta dogodek in upam, da se kmalu spet vidimo na kakšnem Prangerjevskem dogodku ali na čem drugem v zvezi s promocijo slovenske književnosti v tujih jezikih.
Hvala.
Hvala.